All right, what's going on? In this video, I'm going to be covering the three pillars of Division One recruiting, and more importantly, Division One development for college golf. So, if you're new here, this is all we talk about on this channel: is helping junior golfers develop to play Division One golf. And if you're a returning subscriber, welcome back. This is going to be a good one. So, let's go ahead and jump into it. So, one of the things that I see most commonly is it's kind of a challenge for parents is typically most parents, most families get very what's the best way to put this, very focused on the tactics of how to have improvement rather than the big picture of how to actually be viewing each one of those tactics, right? So what do I mean by that? Well, we go in and we get swing lessons because that's what we're supposed to do, right? But we're not actually saying like, how does this move us toward our long-term goal in a very precise way? And that's not necessarily like your fault if you're watching this and if that's what you're doing right now. But this is just a video that's really going to go into how do we actually prepare your child for college golf, even if they're in a position where maybe they're not sure where they want to play or what level that they want to play at, just so that they have the options that also allows golf to stay fun while they're continuing to pursue that. That way we don't fall into this thing of, hey, well, I'm going to worry about that once sophomore year, junior year comes around. At the end of the day, if you want to be successful in this, we got to be thinking about this earlier, 12 years old, 13, 14. That's really when we're going to have the biggest opportunity to be able to capitalize on, the future possibilities. In the same way, it's like, if you want to go to Harvard, you need to have a 4.0, and realistically, you need to be in the right tracks as far as academics go before you even get to high school, right? Like, are we going to be in advanced math? Are we going to be taking algebra, or are we going to be taking algebra 2? Are we going to be in geometry, right? Those are kind of things that we might be considering if we're trying to go to an Ivy League. Playing Division I golf is technically harder than getting into a school like Harvard, right? And so we have to have the same amount of forethought that goes into it, right? So especially if we want to play at high level programs, there's a lot of benefits from doing that, right? I know some of you guys are going to be like, hey, what about D2, D3? Follows the same exact process. You just end up doing this at a lower level. And there's a little bit more legwork once it comes to the actual recruiting. So my recommendation here, get the right framework in place early. And that's going to make this process so much easier, so much more enjoyable, much lower stress for your child as well. So let's go ahead and get into it. So there's three main pillars here. The first one is rankings. So I talk about rankings a lot. Rankings are essential. Rankings are the foundation of recruiting. Okay. And so if your rankings are screwed up, you're going to have a hard time with recruiting. If your rankings are awesome, then coaches are just going to reach out to your child once June 15th of sophomore year comes around, and they can actually legally reach out to your child. Okay. So when I talk about that, if you go to rankings and honors college signing on Junior Golf Scoreboard, it's really important that we're ranked on Junior Golf Scoreboard, not just like some random ranking thing, but specifically on Junior Golf Scoreboard. We're able to see all the players that are recruited all the way back to 2018. And so I'm looking at 2025 because it's the most complete for us. We can see this for both boys and girls. So we can see which programs recruited, what the scoring differential of those players was, and then where that player was ranked in their class when they got recruited. And so this allows us to say, hey, if I want to play at Stanford, then we need to have a negative 7.4 scoring differential. Okay. And so it gives us a real frame of reference here on where we need to be, where our long-term target is. This is not going into tournaments and saying, hey, I hope I do good. It's not, hey, well, if I can win an event, maybe I'll get a shot. It's very precise about saying, hey, here's where we need to be as the kind of that foundation, right? Now, the next step in this is getting ranked, right? Actually being in a position where we can say, hey, my scoring differential is whatever it is right now. So let's just look at this and say, maybe your child is class of 2031. That's an example here. It's being able to go to a page like this and being able to say, okay, cool, whatever our scoring differential is, that's what it is. And we've got this much time in before we're able to get recruited. And so we need to improve by a certain number of shots over that amount of time, right? So, let's say your kid is in 8th grade. They've got 3 years until recruiting starts. So they've got wherever they're ranked currently, wherever that program is that they want to get recruited by, they've got that amount of time that they have. So they got 3 years. So let's say they need to improve by, call it 10 shots divided by 3. They need to improve by 3.3 shots per year, right? And so we can break that down into quarterly, we can break that into monthly. But long story short, it allows us to have an objective standard of like where are we at versus our goals, so that everything we do can be very measured, right? We can actually say like, hey, are we making progress? It's not just, hey, I feel like I'm making progress. It's no, objectively, I was here a month ago or a quarter ago, and now I'm here, and that's better or it's worse, right? We want to be able to see that stuff so we really have a concrete idea of just what's going on, right? So that's really foundation number one, is actually that process of getting ranked. And I'll have some resources below on how I can help you actually do that and what that actually looks like. What are the right tournaments for your child to be playing in? Because fundamentally, you got to play in the right events. If you're just playing a bunch of random 18-hole tournaments, that's not going to do it for them. We need to be playing in the right ranked events. And so again, resources below on that specific topic if you want help with that. Now, just to kind of use an example here. So one of the students that I work with. And so I'm looking at this because it allows us to see, hey, whatever our scoring differential is, right? In his case, 8th grade, we got our scoring differential. We've got which is a product of our scoring average and the average difficulty of the tournaments that we're playing in. Okay. Those are the two main variables here. So we can make sure these tournaments are obviously ranked, right? We've already been over that. If your child's not ranked, if you don't know if they're ranked, then resources below. But we want to make sure once we've done that, we're also playing in the longest, hardest tournaments that we can, that are still appropriate for where your child's at, right? So what do I mean by that? If your child hits at 220 off the tee, they don't need to be playing at 7,000 yards. That's ridiculous, right? So it's being able to balance this in the right way. But, we see the average, the tournaments here, and we've got the scoring average. And so a player's development really falls under, those two things. We need to be able to both increase the length and difficulty of tournaments and lower the scoring average. And we're going to be able to see that represented in the scoring differential. So for this player, started working with him in July. So he had a scoring differential of 3.59. Now he's down to negative 1.08 over the last however many months that is, going on about 10 months. Okay. And so he's definitely improved faster than average. The average player I work with improves by about 4 shots per year. And so, that's really what this process should look like. Now, the next pillar, right, is stat tracking. We need to understand not just, hey, we shoot whatever scores we shoot. We want to understand why we shoot those scores. And this is the next place where I see parents really be way far off, is we have these ideas about whatever, we're struggling with as far as scoring goes, but we don't have that in any concrete sense. And what ends up happening as a result of that is there's a good shot that your child is going into every single event where it's just like, I hope I do, great. I hope I win the tournament. I hope I shoot this score. And it allows a lot of room for, well, if I have a bad hole, then, that took me out of contention and now I don't care. And now I spiral for 3 holes before I figure it out again. Right. Versus understanding, okay, here's the game that I'm trying to play. Here's what I need to improve. And if I'm able to do that, then I'm going to accomplish my goals. Right. So let's go ahead into stat tracking here. So when we are tracking our statistics, this is my preferred tool. It's called Draw More Circles. They're awesome. When we are doing that, we're going to get a bunch of statistics. This is true for every stats tool. Most of these don't really matter, it's like, or they're kind of extra descriptions of what's going on. But most of these don't really move the needle that much. And so we just want to make sure that we're tracking this stuff because we're going to be able to dive a little bit deeper here. And so this is just a resource that I give all of my students. This is something that I'm using when I'm working with players, which is kind of an analysis spreadsheet of what are the major statistics that matter. And then based off of those numbers, what are we probable to shoot as a result of that? Okay. And so this allows us to mathematically quantify what's the easiest thing for us to improve, right? And where's the meat on the bone, right? I can say, hey, let me change penalty rate, and that's going to change the projected score, right? In this case, it doesn't really change it that much. And I'm able to compare that to something like, well, in this case, what if I change greens regulation? Well, that has a pretty big impact, right? Improved by 0.6 shots. And so this allows us to systematically identify, hey, where are the holes in our game, not based off opinion or what someone said, just based on math. And then be able to say, okay, cool, out of all these things, that's where we need to put the attention. That's where our low-hanging fruit is, okay? Now, once we have that framework, we've got our statistics, we understand what's going on, we understand what we should be shooting, right? Not some idealized best case scenario, but what do our statistics show that we should shoot on average, and then where do we need to put our focus? We need to have the third pillar here, which is having the right development plan. We need to not just say, hey, I'm ranked and this is why I shoot the scores that I'm shooting, but what do I do about that, and how specifically am I going to improve that, right? It can't just be, we're just going to go get a bunch of lessons, right? Just get the same lesson over and over again and be like, oh yeah, we just got to do it because that's what we think we got to do. It's not just, hey, I got to go work super hard because, people work hard at stuff, right? We want to be very precise about, hey, I'm trying to improve greens regulation. What am I going to do in order to improve that? Okay. And so again, when I'm working with students, I document all this stuff because for me, I want to know, what are we doing? I work with a good chunk of students. And so I need to have continuity across everybody. And they're like, all right, what did we talk about last? And where are we at right now? What specifically are we going to do to change those things? And so I'll kind of get into the notation here that I like to use in a second here. But the main pillars that I'm kind of going off of are, number one, strategy, which is essentially, what are we trying to do? Like, what specifically can each shot accomplish, right? On an approach shot, can I hit it close to the pin? Can I hit it on the green? What's realistic for that shot? And that changes, obviously. It's like, if I've got a wedge in my hand, I probably have different expectations for what's possible comparatively to having a 4-iron in my hand, right? And so those things are going to change what we're expecting of ourselves, right? So strategy, that's where most players I see are off course, just like right away. So they don't have appropriate expectations, and that leads to cascading problems throughout the rest of their game and these kind of pillars. So what are we trying to do? Strategy. Number two, mindset. How sold are we on that thing? Right. And so that might be a little bit different than what you might think of when you think of mindset, right? It's really important with mindset that we do not create it as a catch-all for I don't shoot the scores that I want to shoot, or my child doesn't shoot the scores that I think that they should be able to shoot. Mindset, very specifically, is the player's ability to commit and execute to the best of their ability on whatever they're trying to do. Okay. And so where we recognize mindset is typically your child has a bad hole, and then they have subsequent bad holes, and eventually they get their head on straight and they're able to perform again. And so, maybe they have a couple of bad shots, their shoulders drop, and all of a sudden they're just mentally disengaged, right? And so that's typically, like I said, comes out of a strategic situation where they hit a few bad shots and they have the expectation in their head, if their mindset was good enough or whatever, that they would never hit bad shots or something along those lines. They believe that at some level, and that's why they have that response, right? Versus being able to see that as like, hey, I hit those bad shots, and that was actually somewhat expected, right? That I was going to hit a few bad shots. And so really what matters now is that I continue to execute on this so that, I give my next shot the highest probability of success, right? It's a different perspective that we want to be able to have, but that starts from the foundation of doing whatever we were supposed to be able to do. To give you another example, this is one of the students that I work with, and I'm thinking of here. He's 11, and he had a few tournaments where he was in contention, right? I think in one case he was like leading the tournament by like 3 shots or something like that, and he was in a position where the correct play, he was behind some trees, the correct play was to pitch out, right? And just get the 3rd shot on the green and 2-putt and go to the next hole, make bogey. Well, he decided he wanted to hit a hero shot, and I believe he ended up making either double or triple as a result of that. And so down the stretch, he ended up losing the tournament just because of that mistake, where he just wasn't sold enough on the importance of getting back in position, actually doing what strategy would dictate that he does. And so his most recent tournament, he ends up winning it because he was following that. He'd had that experience. It was just like, oh, I should have done that and seen it, and then thought out the plan, was a little bit more sold, and is able to win his tournament as a result of that, right? So that's mindset. Also want to be clear, there's an element of mindset where it's like, hey, maybe our hands are shaking or something like that. We're going to set that aside for now. There are things that we can do in order to address that. 9 times out of 10, though, it's usually the mental side of things where we just don't have strategy sorted out. So that's number 2. Number 3 here is practice, right? So I can know the right thing to do. I could be sold on it and have no ability to actually execute on that because I don't practice in a structured way. I don't actually practice that skill. For example, I could say, hey, you need to hit 1 shot shape off the tee, and you could be like, yeah, no, that makes sense. and you could be super sold on that and have no ability to do that because you never hit tee shots. Right? Like that would be an example here. And so we want to make sure that within our practice, we're not just putting in work, but we're putting in work in the right format, in the right areas, right? So it's not just working hard, but working hard on specific things, right? So we've got our strategy or the what we're trying to do. We've got the mindset. How sold are we? The practice. Are we putting in the work to be able to develop that particular skill that strategy necessitates that we develop? And then the last one here is mechanics. And so people get mechanics wrong, in my opinion. People start with mechanics. Coaches start with mechanics because it's easy, right? You show up on their driving range or in their bay. They watch you hit a few balls. They tell you what they don't like, and they go ahead and make changes. Either your child starts hitting it better, in which case everybody's happy, and we hope that we can do it on the golf course. And if they're not hitting it better, then it's like, well, it's got to trust the process. And I've witnessed families tolerate that narrative for years, and it's really just unproductive, right? Because the whole point of all this stuff is to shoot lower scores, right? Versus if we go into mechanics and let's say we hit the ball worse, how long do we tolerate hitting the ball worse before we say, hey, maybe this isn't working? Well, if you don't have the other frameworks that I've just been over here, well, you're going to tolerate that for a really long time, because you might have a 12-year-old and say, well, I don't care if they're the best 12-year-old. I just want them to be the best 16-year-old or 17-year-old. And that sounds reasonable until you actually scrutinize that from the perspective of, well, they need to be able to score. And it's not reasonable that they improve faster than a certain amount. It's not like one day it's just all going to click and now they're going to be 10 shots better. It might seem that way, but that's not actually how scoring and averages really work out. And so it's important to have that perspective. So what is mechanics for? Let me answer that for you guys. Mechanics is to make the other things easier, right? So I could be sold on the right thing. I could be doing the right thing, sold on it, be practicing it, and just not be very good at it. Okay. So for example, trying to hit one shot shape on my approach shots. I'm sold on that mentally. I know I need to hit one shot shape. I'm putting in the work, right? I'm going out, I'm doing my drills, I'm trying to hit one shot shape, I'm trying to beat my numbers, but I'm just not very good at it, right? I'm trying to draw the ball, but it fades sometimes. Sometimes I hit kind of like a pull hook. And just long story short, I've been working on the right practice for a while, and it's not, I've kind of hit a ceiling. Maybe there's a certain amount that we can improve just by hard work. And pretty much everybody experiences that. It's like if your child is shooting 95, then their biggest thing that they need to do realistically is play a lot more golf. And practice a lot. Like that's going to get them at least into the mid 80s, if not into the low 80s. But if your child's shooting 78 to 82, somewhere in that range, well, they're kind of reaching that point where in order to continue to improve, just putting in work doesn't necessarily benefit us quite as much. We need to be a little bit more deliberate, right? So the mechanics is saying, okay, cool, we're trying to hit this draw. Sometimes it fades, sometimes it pulls hooks. Well, let's look at the swing, because we're doing everything else. The only option that we have is to look at the swing. Now, why do we put that last? Well, because that has the least leverage out of all these things in order to change our scores. What do I mean when I say leverage? When I say leverage, what I mean is how fast are we able to get the result, and how probable is it that we get the result, right? So if I say, hey, here's a strategic error that you're making, right? Let's say you are trying to hit hooks around trees rather than just pitching out. Well, I can say pretty confidently the correct move in those cases, especially if we're making doubles, which is the whole reason we'd be talking about it in the first place, would be to say, let's get back out in position. Let's get back into position. Let's save ourselves those shots. Sometimes you're still going to make par. A good chunk of the time we're going to make bogey, and that's okay. And so that's a pretty easy thing to do. The player can execute on that immediately, right? Mindset's in a similar boat. If we got our strategy sorted out, a lot of the time that carries over and just fixes our mindset too, right? So we can fix that pretty quickly as well. Practice, how many times do you have to hit a pitching wedge to be able to hit a pitching wedge on the green a little bit more often than you do right now? With the right strategy, probably not that long. It doesn't take that long, and there's very little downside, right? It's like, let's say you do that and maybe it wasn't the right thing to do. It's like, are you going to get worse at hitting pitching wedges? No, of course not. Versus mechanics. Well, if I try and change something mechanically, as you probably know at this point, I could take weeks. I might not hit it better. It could take months. And I could hit it better, and I don't score better, right? So at that point, I put in a lot of time, effort, resources for not a whole lot as far as scores go. And the whole point of all of this is to shoot lower scores. Like the whole point of golf is to shoot lower scores. And so the whole point of having a development plan or whatever you guys decide to do, it's to shoot lower scores, right? And so that's why I put mechanics last, because once we have everything else sorted out, well, then fixing the mechanics has a much bigger impact, right? It has a more immediate impact, right? So it's not just, hey, we want to put that last. It's, we want to have everything in there first. So when we fix the mechanics, everything else kind of flows a lot more naturally, right? We get the end result that we're going for. Because at the end of the day, you're watching this video because your child wants to play high-level college golf. It's not, hey, I want to have a good-looking golf swing. We want to have a good-looking golf swing insofar as it helps us play college golf, right? So we got to have this entire scaffolding and framework. So when I'm working with a player, I'm looking at it through that hierarchy. I'm saying, okay, out of all these areas here, what's the easiest to improve, right? And then I'm applying that framework that I just went through with you to each one of these areas, right? So it's like penalty rate. There's a whole layer of strategy, mindset, practice, and mechanics that applies specifically to penalty rate, right? And the skills underlying that, right? Tee shots, stuff like that. Greens regulation, same thing, right? There's a different strategy that applies to an approach shot. What's the pin position? What's the wind? How do we figure all that stuff out? Those are all strategic things, mental things, practice, etc. Scrambling, same thing, right? Completely different objective comparatively to hitting the ball on the green. Three putting, you guys can't quite see it, but that's what this is, three putting here. Different strategy applies to that. We can even break that down deeper and say, well, lag putting versus ability to make shorter putts. Those are two completely different skills. And so as a result of those different skills, we have different strategy, we have different mindset, we have different practice, and we have different mechanics that are going to apply to those. And then we have birdie conversion rate as well, right? Again, strategy, mindset, practice, mechanics, those are all going to apply differently, right? For that, a little bit more into green reading. Comparatively to three putting, we don't have to do a lot of green reading and not three putt. We just need to have good speed. We need to be able to start the ball on line. Different things, different strategy, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's this process of saying, hey, what's the main thing right now that's going to have the biggest impact? And then saying within that hierarchy, what's the main change that we can make that has the most sure probability of getting the thing that we want? Okay. So in this case, when I'm working with a student, I'm looking at, well, what is that stuff? What are the adjustments that I want to make? Right? What's kind of like the low-hanging fruit for them? And then what do I want them to do specifically in their practice? What are the specific drills? And so I have documentation on each one of these drills, how I like to see this. And the cool thing for me is working with as many players as I do, I get to see all of their data. Right? I get to see which drills work the best to accomplish whatever our ends are. Right? So I can actually look at this and say, hey, we need to improve greens regulation. I know that this consistently solves this problem. Right? That's kind of the benefit for me or the players that are working with me is I can say like, hey, I've seen this a million times and here's the fix we need to do. They can get that result because we're measuring it. We know that we got the result. And we can move on to the next thing, right? And so that's where this documentation is so important, right? Because we can also say objectively, where are we at on Junior Golf Scoreboard? Where are our statistics, right? What are our biggest opportunities, et cetera? And then when we update this, I like to update this every single month. We can see, are we making progress, right? Where are we at in our class? Where are those major statistics trending for us as a result of that? And because of that, what changes are we going to make, right? That's really what it takes to be able to improve consistently, or at least that's why I believe that when I'm working with players, they're able to improve substantially faster than average, is because we're so precise about each one of these steps. Okay. So hopefully this helped you understand the process a little bit better of how to help your child develop to play, high level college Division I golf. Again, just in summary here, playing in the right tournaments, right? Making sure that we are ranked. Again, if you want help with that, either knowing the right tournaments to play in, as far as being ranked, but also like if your child's already ranked, making sure that they get the most out of every single tournament. That way, when you're spending money, you're getting the most out of it, right? Because golf's not cheap. We want to make sure that we are as resourceful as possible with the resources that we have, right? Tracking statistics. So making sure we're not just saying, hey, we go out there, we get ranked, but it's like, okay, cool. We know a major lever is going to be our scores. Why do we shoot the scores we shoot? That's the next major piece here. Third one is, what are we going to do about it? Right? If the answer is just, we're going to go get weekly lessons, hopefully you can see, hopefully if I've kind of explained here why that might not be the best course of action, right? It is a thing, right? I'm not invalidating swing lesson. What I'm saying is if you want to help your child improve as quickly as possible, then we want to focus on the high leverage things in that order that I laid out for the reasons that I laid out. Okay. So if you want help with any of this stuff, again, resources below in the description. Whether you want help specifically with the tournament stuff getting started, because I know a lot of families are in that spot, or if you want a little bit more direct help from me, you want to actually get on a call and kind of see just where your child's at and just say, hey, what's realistic and what would make the most sense. You can do that as well. There'll be a link for both of those things down below. So hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one.